Montana Territory, 1881. The wind came down from the mountains like it carried a warning, flattening the tall grass as the sun burned low behind the peaks. Orion Stokes stood at the edge of his land, one boot on the bottom rail of the fence, hat low over his eyes, shotgun resting lazy in the crook of his arm. He was a man known more for what he did not say than for what he did. Folks around the Stillwater River said he had not spoken a full sentence in over a year, and even before that he never wasted words. Only thing louder than Orion's silence was the way he worked hard, steady, sunup to sundown. No one came up his lane unless they had to. So when the wagon limped into view, one wheel wobbling, the horse lathered and sides heaving, Orion narrowed his eyes. The driver was a woman, alone. She gripped the reins tight, her hair messy under a bonnet, her dress dusted pale with road dirt, and she was pregnant, clearly, heavily so. She pulled the wagon to a stop just past his fence, and her eyes met his, brown, sharp, and tired. "I need help," she said, voice firm even though her hands trembled. "Please." Orion did not answer. He did not move, but he did not look away either. She climbed down slowly, one hand on her belly. Her boots hit the dirt, and she winced. "I am not looking to cause trouble. I just need a place to rest a while. The wheel's about to come off and I cannot go any farther tonight." Still, Orion said nothing, but he stepped forward. The fence gate gave a low groan as he opened it. He nodded once, then turned and started walking toward the barn. An unspoken invitation. The woman let out a breath she had clearly been holding. She guided the horse and wagon in after him. Inside the barn, Orion pointed to some stacked hay and a water trough. Then he set to work on the broken wheel, silent but efficient. "My name's Norah," she said after a while. "Norah Alden. I came from Fort Benton, headed toward Red Lodge. Or I was." Orion kept tightening bolts. She leaned against a beam, one hand pressed to her back. "I am not running from anything, if that is what you are thinking." He looked up then, just a glance, but his eyes stayed on hers longer than anyone else's had in months. "I am just trying to find someplace I can raise this child. I got no one, not anymore." He stood and wiped his hands on a cloth. Then he turned and walked out of the barn without a word. Norah blinked after him, confused, hurt rising in her chest. But a few minutes later he returned. In his arms was a worn quilt, and in his hand, a tin cup of water. He handed both to her. Her lips parted. "Thank you." He nodded once, eyes steady on hers. That night, she slept in the barn loft, curled under the quilt. Orion stayed out in the barn too, a few feet below, sitting on an overturned bucket, his shotgun across his knees. She woke once in the dark and saw him still there, keeping watch. The next morning, he brought her a plate bread, a boiled egg, and an apple from the tree in his yard. "You do not talk much," she said gently, sitting on a hay bale as she ate. He shrugged. "Can I ask your name?" He hesitated, then said, "Orion Stokes." It was the first time she had heard his voice. It was quiet, low, and flat as the prairie, but it was not unfriendly. She smiled. "Thank you for letting me stay the night, Mr. Stokes." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "Stay longer. Wagon needs more work. You should rest." Her brows lifted. "Are you sure?" He gave a single nod. And so Norah stayed. One day became two. Two became 5. She did not ask many questions, and he did not offer any explanations. But in the silence between them, something warm began to settle. She helped where she could, feeding the chickens, brushing down his horse. He fixed her wagon, repaired her boots, whittled a walking stick for her when her legs started to ache. One evening, they sat outside under the porch, the sky streaked in gold and purple, her hands resting on her round belly. "Do you live out here all alone?" she asked softly. He nodded. "No family?" He shook his head. She looked at him then, really looked. His face was hard-lined from sun and loss. His hands were calloused, his shoulders wide with the weight of years carried alone. "I lost my husband last spring," she said. "He was a kind man, a good man. Wagon accident." Her throat tightened. "We had only just found out about the baby." He did not speak, but he reached out and set a hand gently beside hers on the porch rail. Not touching, just near, present. Her voice wavered. "I was going to stay with my cousin in Red Lodge, but she wrote last week. Said she moved. Said she could not take me in." Orion's eyes flicked to hers. "I do not know where else to go," she whispered. He stood then, walked a few paces away. For a long time he stared out across the wide stretch of land, where the fields rolled down toward the river. Then he turned back. "You can stay," he said. Norah blinked. "You mean here?" He nodded. "You barely know me." "I know enough." She stared at him, her heart thudding. "You do not have to do this, Orion." He stepped toward her, slow. Then, with a voice raw from disuse, he said, "You do not have to be alone anymore." She covered her mouth with her hand, tears stinging her eyes, and something shifted between them, quiet and real, not sharp, not sudden, but steady, strong. She reached out and touched his arm. "Neither do you." For a long time he did not move. Then he placed his hand over hers. And for the first time in a long while Orion Stokes smiled. A small one. But it stayed. The frost came early that year. By the time the first week of October settled in, Orion had already brought the last of the squash in from the garden and stacked split pine under the back eave. The air had turned sharp, and Norah's breath showed pale in the mornings as she moved slower now, careful with every step. He built a fire in the parlor each evening, not speaking, but always making sure the chair nearest the warmth was ready for her. She began sewing small things in the evening's tiny shirts, socks no bigger than her palm. He didn't ask questions about them, just watched her fingers move with surprising gentleness for a woman who had been alone on the road. One morning, she caught him mending a tear in his sleeve with thread that didn't match. She sat beside him without asking and took the shirt from his hands. "You sew like you're patching a fence?" she said softly, threading her needle. "You saying it's no good?" "I'm saying it'll hold, but it'll show." He studied her for a moment, then said, "Maybe I don't mind it showing." She glanced at him, surprised. His voice still held that low, sanded-down edge, but there was something else in it now, wry, almost dry. "You always try to sound older than you look?" she asked. "I don't try at anything." Norah laughed, the sound quiet but unguarded. It was the first time he'd heard it. Something in his chest shifted, unfamiliar and weightless. As the days shortened, she began waking earlier, restless, her body readying itself. Orion adjusted his routine to match without saying why, feeding the stock before dawn, setting water to boil before she came downstairs, sweeping tracks from the floor before they could tire her. One morning, she came in from the outhouse pale and quiet. He didn't speak, just looked up from where he was oiling his saddle. "I think it's close," she said, folding her hands over the round of her belly. He set the rag down. "Could be days. Could be tonight. I don't know yet." He nodded once, then stood and walked out. She watched him through the window as he saddled the sorrel gelding and rode off west, toward the low hills. He returned near dusk with a woman riding behind him. She was older, with a lined face and eyes sharp as a hawk's. He helped her down without a word, then carried her bag into the house. Norah met them at the door, confused. The woman gave her a once-over and said, "Name's Alma. Orion tells me you're set to deliver soon." Norah looked at him, startled. You went to find a midwife? He lifted his shoulder, like it had been nothing. Alma stepped inside without waiting for an answer. He didn't say much, but I could tell it mattered. He rode all the way to my brother's homestead just to find me. That's over 20 miles. Norah's eyes stung, and she looked down quickly. That night, Orion slept in the barn again. Alma stayed in the house, setting herbs to soak and boiling cloths. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. Norah sat by the fire, both hands curved over her belly, the child within pressing low. Alma handed her a mug of bitter-smelling tea. "He's a quiet one," she said, settling into the rocker across from her. Norah nodded, but not absent. "That's different." She looked up. "Men like him, they don't say much, but they show it. You just have to learn to read the language they speak." "I think I'm starting to," Norah whispered. Alma's eyes softened. "Then you'll be fine." The birth came 2 nights later, through a storm that cracked the sky wide open. Orion waited just outside the bedroom, not moving for hours, listening to every cry and breath. He didn't go in, not once. But when Alma finally opened the door at dawn, soaked in sweat and relief, he was still right there. "She's resting," Alma said. "And your daughter's got lungs like a freight whistle." He blinked. "Daughter?" Alma nodded, smiling. "Strong little thing, just like her mother." He stepped past her, slow. The bedroom smelled of lavender and iron. Norah lay against the pillows, pale but glowing in the faint light. The baby was tucked against her chest, wrapped in the quilt he'd given her that first night. Norah looked at him, eyes rimmed red but filled with something clear and deep. "Come meet her." He crossed the room quietly, boots soft on the floorboards. She shifted, making room. He sat on the edge of the bed, eyes wide as the child stirred, yawned, and settled again. "She's got your mouth," Norah said. He didn't speak, just reached out and touched the baby's hand with one finger. She grabbed it, fierce and sudden. Norah smiled. "I haven't named her yet." He looked up. "I thought maybe you'd like to." He opened his mouth, then closed it. His throat worked as he searched for something. Anything. "Clara," he said at last. Norah blinked. "That was my mother's name." He nodded, eyes still on the tiny fingers curled around his own. She reached for his hand. "You brought us through the storm, Orion." He didn't answer, but he didn't let go either. Norah leaned her head against his shoulder, the baby sleeping between them, the world gone hushed around the edges. And in that quiet, neither one spoke of the road behind them, only the one ahead. The first snow dusted the roof before Clara had learned to lift her head. The cabin stood quiet in the white hush, smoke curling from the chimney, the barn roof sagging beneath the weight of it. Norah sat near the stove with Clara swaddled against her chest, watching the flurries gather along the window's edge while Orion carved something small at the table. "Is that for her?" she asked. He nodded, not pausing in his work. The wood curled beneath his knife, revealing the shape of a horse mid-trot, no bigger than his palm. "She'll chew the ears off that in a week," Norah said, smiling faintly. "I'll make another." She shifted Clara slightly, brushing a thumb along the baby's downy brow. "You always fix things before they're broken?" Orion set the carving knife down and met her eyes. "If I know what's coming, I like to be ready." She studied him. "And if you don't?" He hesitated. "Then I make do." Winter closed in slow and steady. Orion led the mare out only to gather firewood or check the trap lines he'd laid back in September. Every time he returned, he shook the snow from his shoulders on the porch, set his rifle near the door, and looked first to where Norah and Clara were. She noticed it, though he didn't speak of it. One afternoon, Norah rocked Clara while Orion patched the roof of the lean-to. The wind had torn loose a few shingles, and he moved with practiced steps, the ladder creaking beneath him. Alma had gone back to her brother's homestead before the freeze, leaving a bundle of dried herbs and a note on when to use them. Norah had read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it inside the pantry ledger. When Orion came back down, she met him with a basin of warm water and a dry shirt. "I don't expect you to do everything alone," she said. "I'm used to it." "I'm not," she said. "And I don't want to be." He looked at her then, not with surprise, but with something deeper recognition. "I keep thinking about what you said," he murmured. She waited. "You said I didn't have to be alone anymore." "I meant it. I didn't know how much I needed to hear that." She stepped closer, careful of the baby nestled between them. "You don't have to know everything right now. You just have to want it." Orion looked down at his hands, then back to her. "I do." That night he came inside before dark. Norah had cooked a bit of salt pork with beans and boiled cornmeal. They ate quietly, Clara sleeping in the cradle Orion had built from larchwood and sheep's wool. Afterward, Norah laid her sewing aside and reached for his hand across the table. "I'd like to marry you," she said, "if you want that too." He didn't answer right away, but he didn't look away. Instead, he turned his hand and laced his fingers through hers. "I do," he said. Their wedding was small, just the two of them, the baby asleep in the sling Norah wore across her chest, and a circuit preacher who passed through on his way toward Bozeman. He said the words quick, his hands red from cold, and took his supper with them before riding on. That night, Norah sat beside Orion on the narrow bed. She leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. "Feels like I've been holding my breath for a long time," she whispered. He turned and kissed her hair, then rested his cheek against it. "You can exhale now," he said, and she did. By the time the creek thawed and the willows showed their first green shoots, Clara had learned to laugh. Not often, not loud, but when she did, it came out sudden and whole, like a bird startled into flight. Orion had never heard a sound like it. He didn't try to make her do it again, just watched with quiet wonder and kept the moment close. Norah had taken to walking the edge of the property each morning with Clara tied up against her chest in a sling made from an old flour sack. Orion mended the fence line while she wandered, and once, when he looked up from his work, she was watching him with a look he didn't have a name for, but it stayed with him through the rest of the day. They didn't speak much about the future, not out loud, but it lived in the way Norah started keeping a written inventory of the pantry, or how Orion added a second rail to the porch steps without being asked. It was in the way she started boiling milkweed root for thread instead of buying spools, and how he began smoothing the ground behind the barn, one shovel full at a time, for a garden she hadn't mentioned but he knew she was thinking of. One evening, as the light stretched long and soft across the floorboards, Norah was wiping down the table when she paused. "Did you ever want to leave Montana?" she asked, her tone even. Orion folded the blade of his pocket knife and set it aside. "Hadn't thought of it. Not once," he considered. "Before, maybe, when I was younger." "What stopped you?" He stood, moved to the window and looked out toward the hills. "Nothing to go chasing. Nothing worth leaving for." She set the rag down. "And now," he turned, eyes meeting hers, "now I've got something worth staying for." Norah's breath caught, but she didn't speak. Instead, she crossed the room and stood close. He traced the edge of her jaw with the back of his hand, rough skin against smooth. She leaned into it, eyes steady. "I've loved you quietly," she said, "like watching the snow fall when you're the only one awake." His arms came around her, unsure at first, then certain. "You don't have to be quiet anymore," he said. She looked up at him. "Neither do you." He kissed her then, not shy, not rushed, just sure. Later that week, with the ground softening and the days stretching longer, Norah planted carrots and onions behind the barn. Orion helped her dig the rows, though she planted the seeds herself. Clara lay on a blanket nearby, gurgling at the sky. A hawk passed overhead, and Norah shaded her eyes to follow it. "You ever think of building more rooms?" she asked. He wiped his brow with his sleeve. "You wanting more space?" "I'm thinking of what Clara might need, and maybe others." He didn't answer, but he picked up the shovel again. This time, he started clearing toward the east side of the house. That night, as they lay in bed with Clara asleep between them, Norah whispered, "You think she'll remember any of this?" "Not the start," he murmured. "But she'll know what it feels like. That kind of peace stays in your bones." Norah reached for his hand beneath the quilt. "Then we'll give her plenty to carry." He turned toward her, brushing the back of his fingers along her arm. "We already have." Outside, the wind moved through the poplars in slow waves. The fire burned low, and in the quiet of the room, nothing was unfinished. Everything was as it should be. The lambing season came wet and late. Orion rose before first light most mornings, boots sinking into soft earth as he moved between lean-tos and pens, checking for signs of distress. He worked quiet and careful as he always had, but now the rhythm of his days bent toward something steadier, something shared. Inside, Norah wove strips of wool into small blankets when Clara napped, her hands never idle. The girl had begun to crawl, dragging herself across the worn wooden floor with determined grunts, her soft fists smudged with ash from the hearth before Norah could catch her. Orion had shaved the corners off the table legs with his drawknife after Clara bumped her cheek just once. One evening, Norah stood by the window watching the rain sheet down while Orion stripped off his coat by the door. Clara sat on the floor chewing a horsehair braid, legs kicking. "She's got your eyes," Norah said, brushing the steam from the glass. "She's got your will," Orion replied, hanging his coat near the fire. Norah turned to face him, arms crossed beneath her ribs. "Do you want more children?" Orion met her gaze. "With you?" "Yes." She stepped toward him, her voice low. "I've been thinking of that too." He took her hand not roughly, but with the quiet certainty he always carried. "Then we'll make room." They did not speak of the past anymore. Not out of avoidance, but because it no longer held weight between them. What had once been grief had become memory, and what had once been silence now held comfort. That spring, a neighbor rode in from the north, a man Orion had traded horses with 3 seasons ago. He brought a wagon load of iron tools and a pair of milk goats, offering one in exchange for lumber he couldn't haul himself. Norah stepped outside with Clara on her hip, her hair pinned up with a strip of linen. "If we're taking in a goat, I'll need a pen built close to the house. I'll be the one milking it." "I'll start it tomorrow," Orion said. The neighbor shaded his eyes. "She always talk like she's been here 40 years? She talks like she's staying," Orion said. They shook on the trade, and the man left before sundown. Norah walked alongside Orion as he led the goat to a temporary stake, Clara reaching out in fascination. "She'll want her own by the time she's 5, Norah said. "If not sooner. I'll sew her a dress with pockets. I never had one growing up." Orion nodded. "She'll have what she needs." In early summer, Norah's cousin arrived by stage, the same one who'd once written to say she couldn't take Norah in. She stepped down with a heavy valise and a guarded look, her face older than Norah remembered. "I was in Red Lodge," she said. "Heard you were settled out here." Norah stood in the yard, Clara holding tight to her skirts. "I am." The cousin's gaze drifted to Orion as he came from the barn, sleeves rolled, dirt on his palms. "You married?" "Yes," Norah said. "I am." "Happy?" Norah looked at Orion, then down at Clara, then back. "Yes." The cousin stayed 2 nights. She left with a jar of honey and a quieter mouth, and Norah did not offer more than that. Later, as they shelled peas on the porch, Orion said, "You didn't ask her to stay longer." "She didn't ask to." He nodded, then passed her another pod. "You're not the same woman who came up this road. You're not the same man who opened that fence." He looked at her then, mouth softening. "I'm glad for both." By harvest, Norah was carrying again. She told him by handing him a pair of tiny socks she'd knit with leftover wool. He didn't speak, just wrapped his arms around her and held her until Clara tugged at his trouser leg, impatient to be noticed. They added a room to the house that autumn, Orion laying each beam with care. Clara toddled between them, dragging her wooden horse behind her, its legs worn smooth. They spent the winter with a second cradle beside the hearth, empty for now, but waiting. On the first warm night of the new year, Norah leaned against Orion, her head on his chest as they watched the fire settle low. Clara slept near the wall, curled in a blanket stitched from their first harvest's cloth. Norah spoke without lifting her head. "You ever think how strange it is, the life we've made?" "No," he said gently. "It feels like the only one that ever fit." She smiled against him, her body softened by love, by time. "You'll teach them both how to ride?" "I'll start with how to fall," he said. "Then how to get up." She took his hand and pressed it to her belly. "Then we'll be ready." And they were. The years passed, not fast but full. Clara grew into a girl with strong legs and a wide laugh. Her brother came in the spring, born with a grip like a mule's and his father's quiet eyes. They named him Elias after no one in particular, only because the name sat right on the tongue. Norah taught them both to read at the kitchen table, her voice steady over the scratch of pencils. Orion taught them how to mend a gate, how to track a fox after snowfall, how to listen to the land before speaking over it. They grew up in a house built by steady hands and quiet love. A house where nothing was rushed, but everything was earned. One night, after the children had gone to sleep, Orion and Norah sat on the porch, the stars scattered thick above them. She leaned into him, her hand resting on his knee. "Do you ever miss the way it was before?" He shook his head. "I never knew what full felt like. Now I do." She kissed his cheek, slow and sure. "So do I." They sat like that until the coals in the stove burned low and the night turned cool against their skin. And even then, they stayed a little longer, just to feel it all around them, the home they'd made, the life they'd chosen, and the love that had come quiet and stayed.